The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty frontier town of Copper Creek as three armed men dragged a fourth from the saloon, his massive frame requiring all their combined strength. At nearly 7 feet tall, the homeless drifter they called Giant Tom towered over his captors even as blood trickled from his split lip. The townspeople gathered in a cautious circle, whispering among themselves as Sheriff Clayton Murdoch stepped forward, his weathered hand resting on his Colt revolver. "You've caused enough trouble here, you freak," Murdoch spat, his tobacco-stained teeth visible through his sneer. "Nobody wants your kind around decent folk." Tom Mackenzie wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his enormous hand, his pale blue eyes scanning the hostile faces surrounding him. His clothes were little more than rags held together by desert dust and desperation, his once noble bearing now hunched with the weight of 2 years spent wandering the unforgiving wilderness. When he spoke, his voice carried an unexpected refinement that seemed to unsettle the crowd even more than his imposing stature. "I meant no harm, Sheriff. I was merely seeking shelter and perhaps some honest work." "Work?" Murdoch laughed harshly. "What kind of work could a vagrant giant like you possibly do? You're nothing but trouble waiting to happen." Before Tom could respond, a sharp crack of thunder rolled across the desert landscape. Dark clouds had been gathering on the horizon throughout the afternoon, and now they advanced with ominous purpose toward the small settlement. The wind picked up suddenly, sending tumbleweeds dancing through the main street and causing the saloon's wooden sign to creak ominously on its chains. Young Billy Parsons, the blacksmith's apprentice, pointed toward the approaching storm with wide eyes. "Sheriff, that looks like a real bad one coming in. Maybe we should let the man take shelter." Murdoch's expression darkened further. "This ain't a charity house, boy. We've got our own people to worry about." He turned back to Tom, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "You've got 10 minutes to get out of town before this storm hits, or I'll make sure you never bother anyone again." Tom nodded slowly, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the dusty street. As he turned to leave, gathering his few meager possessions from where they'd been thrown in the dirt, a small voice called out from behind him. "Wait, mister." Everyone turned to see Maria Consuela, the Mexican woman who ran the town's general store, stepping forward despite her husband's frantic gestures for her to stay back. She was clutching a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Take this," she said in heavily accented English, pressing the package into Tom's enormous hands. "There's bread and dried meat. The storm, she will be bad." Tom's eyes softened as he looked down at the small woman who barely reached his chest. "Gracias, señora. Su bondad no será olvidada." The crowd murmured in surprise at his perfect Spanish, but Maria's eyes widened with something approaching recognition. "You speak like an educated man," she whispered. Before Tom could reply, Sheriff Murdoch grabbed Maria's arm roughly. "Get back to your store, woman. Don't encourage this drifter." But Tom's massive hand closed gently over Murdoch's wrist, his grip firm but controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that hadn't been there moments before. "I suggest you release the lady, Sheriff. A gentleman never manhandles a woman, regardless of his station." For a moment, the two men stared at each other, and something in Tom's eyes made Murdoch release Maria and take a step back. The drifter's entire demeanor had shifted, revealing glimpses of education, breeding, and perhaps even nobility beneath the worn exterior. 5 minutes, Murdoch muttered, clearly unsettled. "Then you're gone." As Tom gathered his belongings and prepared to face the approaching storm, Maria caught his arm once more. "The Dragoon Mountains," she whispered urgently. "There are caves there. Sacred places. But be careful, señor. The Apache, they do not welcome strangers." Tom nodded gravely. "I understand. Muchas gracias por todo." As he walked toward the edge of town, his long strides carrying him quickly across the desert floor, the first fat raindrops began to fall. Behind him, the townspeople watched with a mixture of relief and curiosity as the mysterious giant disappeared into the gathering darkness. The storm struck with biblical fury just as Tom reached the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. Lightning illuminated the harsh landscape in stark black and white, while thunder crashed overhead like the drums of war. The rain came down in sheets, turning the dry arroyos into raging torrents within minutes. Tom pressed forward, his massive frame bent against the wind, seeking the shelter Maria had described. Hours passed as he climbed through the treacherous terrain, his clothes soaked through and his body battered by wind and rain. Just when exhaustion threatened to overcome him, a brilliant flash of lightning revealed a dark opening in the rock face ahead. Tom stumbled toward it, grateful for any refuge from the storm's fury. The cave was deeper than he'd expected, stretching back into the mountain's heart. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Tom noticed something that made him pause. The walls were covered with ancient pictographs, their red and black pigment still vivid despite the passage of countless years. He recognized the symbols immediately, his academic training allowing him to interpret the sacred Apache artwork that told stories of hunts, ceremonies, and spiritual visions. "This is a holy place," he murmured to himself in perfect Apache dialect, his voice echoing softly in the chamber. As if summoned by his words, a figure emerged from the deeper shadows of the cave. An elderly Apache man stepped into the dim light, his weathered face marked by decades of desert sun and wind. He wore traditional clothing adorned with intricate beadwork, and his long gray hair was braided with eagle feathers. Behind him, 3 other figures materialized from the darkness, all elderly, all carrying the unmistakable bearing of tribal elders. Tom slowly raised his hands in a gesture of peace, careful not to make any sudden movements. The lead elder, his dark eyes sharp and intelligent, studied the giant intruder with intense curiosity. "You are far from your people, white man," the elder said in English, his voice carrying the weight of authority and wisdom. Tom bowed his head respectfully before responding. "I am alone in this world, grandfather. I seek only shelter from the storm." The elder's eyes narrowed slightly at Tom's use of the respectful Apache term for an elder. "You know our ways?" "I know some things," Tom replied carefully. "I have great respect for your people and your sacred places. If I have trespassed, I ask your forgiveness." One of the other elders, a man with ritual scars across his cheeks, stepped forward and spoke rapidly in Apache. Tom listened intently, understanding every word as they debated whether to trust this strange giant who had appeared in their sacred cave during the storm. What happened next would change everything. Tom cleared his throat softly and, in flawless Apache, addressed the elders directly. "Honored grandfathers, I understand your caution. A stranger in sacred spaces is cause for concern. But I come to you not as an enemy, but as one who has walked far from home and carries the weight of many sorrows. If you will permit me to remain until the storm passes, I will share what knowledge I have in exchange for your wisdom." The silence that followed was deafening. The 4 elders stared at the giant white man who spoke their language with the fluency and respect of one born to their tribe. But there was more than just linguistic ability in his words, there was understanding of their cultural protocols, their spiritual beliefs, their very worldview. Chief Nailnish, the eldest of the group, stepped closer to Tom, his ancient eyes searching the giant's face in the flickering shadows cast by the storm's lightning. "Who are you, stranger? What manner of man learns the tongue of the Chiricahua with such precision?" Tom hesitated, the weight of his past pressing down upon him like the storm raging outside. "I am Thomas Mackenzie, grandfather. I was once a teacher of languages in the eastern cities. I have studied the words of many peoples, seeking to understand the wisdom contained in each tongue." 9 languages, Tom continued, his voice barely audible above the thunder. "English, Spanish, French, German, Latin, Greek, Apache, Navajo, and Lakota. But knowledge without wisdom is merely noise, and I have learned that a man can lose everything that matters even while his mind holds the words of the world." Chief Nailnish exchanged glances with his fellow elders, their faces reflecting a mixture of amazement and skepticism. Never in their long lives had they encountered a white man who demonstrated such linguistic mastery and cultural sensitivity. "Tell us, Thomas Mackenzie," Chief Nailnish said slowly, "how does a teacher of languages come to wander the desert like a lost spirit?" The storm outside seemed to intensify as Tom prepared to reveal the truth that had driven him to this desolate place. His massive frame seemed to shrink slightly as the weight of memory settled upon his shoulders, and in the darkness of the sacred cave, surrounded by men who might be his salvation or his doom, the giant began to tell his story. The Apache elders listened in growing amazement as Tom spoke of his former life, his fall from grace, and the long journey that had brought him to their sacred mountain. But as his tale unfolded, they began to realize that this mysterious giant might be far more than a simple drifter seeking shelter from the storm. The question that would define everything that followed remained unspoken but hung heavy in the air between them: could this broken man truly be the bridge between two worlds that ancient prophecies had foretold? As lightning continued to illuminate the sacred cave and thunder shook the very foundations of the mountain, the first chapter of an extraordinary encounter was only beginning to unfold. The storm's fury continued to batter the mountainside as Tom Mackenzie sat cross-legged on the cave floor, his massive frame dwarfed by the weight of memories he was about to share. Chief Nailnish and the 3 other Apache elders formed a semicircle around him, their weathered faces illuminated by the intermittent flashes of lightning that penetrated the cave's entrance. The sacred pictographs on the walls seemed to dance in the flickering light, ancient spirits bearing witness to a confession that would change everything. "My story begins in Boston," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying across the chamber like a prayer. "I was Professor Thomas Mackenzie of Harvard University, a man who believed that understanding language was the key to understanding the human soul. I had dedicated my life to preserving the tongues of vanishing peoples, documenting their wisdom before it disappeared forever." Elder Cochise, named for the great warrior chief, leaned forward slightly. "You studied our words not to conquer, but to preserve?" "Yes, grandfather. I spent 3 years living among the Lakota, 2 with the Navajo, and nearly 4 here in Apache territory, learning not just your languages but your ways of seeing the world. I believed that every tongue lost was a library burned, a piece of human understanding gone forever." Chief Nailnish's ancient eyes narrowed with recognition. "I remember you now. The tall white man who came to our camps in the time before the Great Troubles. You were different from the others. You listened more than you spoke." Tom's massive hands clenched into fists as the painful memory surfaced. "In 1883, tensions between the cavalry and your people were reaching a breaking point. Colonel Morrison of Fort Bowie was planning a brutal campaign that would have destroyed the remaining free Apache bands. When I learned of his intentions, I tried to warn Chief Geronimo through intermediaries. The silence that followed was broken only by the thunder rolling across the desert landscape. Elder Yellow Hawk, his face marked by ritual scars, spoke in rapid Apache to his companions before addressing Tom directly. "You were the one. The shadow messenger who sent word of the Bluecoats' movements. Many of our people lived because of those warnings." Tom's voice grew heavy with anguish. "Colonel Morrison discovered my communications. He accused me of treason, of being a spy for the Apache Nation. My colleagues at Harvard, fearing association with a suspected traitor, abandoned me. The university stripped me of my position. My wife." His voice broke slightly. "Elizabeth couldn't bear the shame. She left with our daughter, changed their names, and disappeared into the eastern cities where no one would know of their connection to the disgraced Professor Mackenzie." The cave fell silent except for the sound of rain drumming against stone. Chief Nailnish studied Tom's face in the dim light, reading the genuine pain etched in every line. "So you came west to die," the chief said simply. "I came west because there was nowhere else to go. For 2 years, I've wandered the desert, taking whatever work I could find, speaking to no one of my past. The knowledge I once treasured has become a burden. What good are 9 languages when no one will listen to what you have to say?" Elder Cochise stood and walked to the cave entrance, gazing out at the storm-lashed landscape. "The spirits have strange ways, Thomas Mackenzie. You have been brought to us on this night for a reason." "What reason could there be, grandfather? I am a broken man with nothing left to offer the world." Chief Nailnish rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement despite his dignity. He approached one of the cave's painted walls and placed his weathered hand against an intricate symbol that depicted 2 figures, one tall and one short, standing together beneath a great bird. "There is an old prophecy among our people," he said, his voice taking on the cadence of ancient storytelling. "It speaks of a time when the Apache Nation would face its greatest trial, when the old ways would be threatened with extinction. The prophecy tells of a giant who would come from the east, a man who could speak with many voices but carried great sorrow in his heart. This giant would serve as a bridge between the world of the white man and the world of the Apache, helping to preserve what must be preserved while teaching what must be learned. Tom looked up sharply, his pale blue eyes reflecting the lightning that continued to illuminate the cave. You can't seriously believe that I am part of some ancient prophecy. Yellow Hawk stepped forward, his scarred face grave. 3 moons ago, we began having the same dream. A giant man standing on the sacred mountain, speaking our language with perfect understanding, teaching our children the old stories while also preparing them for the new world that was coming. When you appeared tonight, speaking our tongue with such reverence, we knew. The storm outside began to weaken, its violent passion giving way to a steady, soaking rain. Tom stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding like a mountain taking shape. Even if your prophecy were true, what could I possibly do? I am an outcast from both worlds now. Chief Nailnish moved to another section of the cave wall, where pictographs depicted scenes of learning and teaching. Tomorrow, a delegation of white officials arrives in the valley below. They come to force the last free Apache children into government schools, to strip away our language and customs forever. Our people are scattered, afraid, and many are ready to surrender everything to avoid further bloodshed. But you have a plan, Tom said, reading the subtle expressions on the elders' faces. We need someone who understands both worlds, who can speak to the white officials in their own language while preserving the sacred knowledge of our people. Someone who can teach our children to survive in the coming world without losing their Apache souls. Elder Cochise turned from the cave entrance, his voice filled with urgency. There are 43 Apache children hidden in the canyons below, the sons and daughters of warriors who died fighting for our freedom. If the officials find them tomorrow, they will be taken to the industrial schools in the east, forced to cut their hair, forbidden to speak Apache, beaten for practicing our customs. Within a generation, they will be Apache in blood only. Tom felt something stirring within him, a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since his fall from grace. What exactly are you proposing, grandfathers? Chief Nailnish stepped closer, his ancient eyes burning with intensity. Help us save these children. Use your knowledge of language and law to negotiate with the white officials. Establish a school here, in Apache territory, where our children can learn the white man's ways while keeping their Apache hearts. You understand our language better than any white man alive. You could teach them to be bridges between worlds, as the prophecy foretells. The implications of what the elders were suggesting began to sink in. Tom would be risking his life, placing himself directly in opposition to government policy. If he were discovered, he would face charges far more serious than the treason accusations that had already destroyed his previous life. Why would you trust me with something so precious? Tom asked quietly. How do you know I won't betray you as others have been betrayed? Yellow Hawk approached Tom and placed his weathered hand on the giant's massive forearm. Because you have already sacrificed everything once to protect our people. Because you speak our language not with the tongue of a conqueror, but with the heart of a brother. And because the spirits have brought you to us in our darkest hour. Thunder rolled across the mountains one final time as the storm began to move eastward. In the growing silence, Tom felt the weight of decision settling upon him. He thought of his lost family, his ruined career, the long months of wandering in the desert like a ghost. Then he looked at the 4 elderly men who were offering him not just redemption, but a chance to transform his accumulated knowledge into something genuinely meaningful. If I do this, Tom said slowly, there's no going back. The authorities will never stop hunting me. I'll be an outlaw for the rest of my life. Chief Nailnish smiled for the first time since Tom had entered the cave. Sometimes, Thomas Mackenzie, a man must become an outlaw to serve a higher law. The question is, are you ready to stop running from your past and start building a future? Tom looked around the sacred cave, at the ancient paintings that had witnessed countless generations of Apache wisdom, at the 4 elders who had somehow seen past his raggedness to the man he could still become. Outside, the desert was being washed clean by the departing storm, and with the dawn would come challenges that would test every skill he had acquired in his years of study and wandering. Tell me about these children, Tom said finally, his voice carrying a new note of authority. Tell me about the officials who are coming. And tell me exactly what this prophecy says about how this is all supposed to end. As Chief Nailnish began to speak of hidden canyons and secret pathways, of brave young souls waiting in the darkness for someone to light their way forward, Tom Mackenzie felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 long years of desert exile: hope. The homeless giant who spoke 9 languages had finally found his purpose, and tomorrow would discover whether the ancient Apache prophecy would prove true or whether he would face his final defeat in the harsh light of the Arizona sun. The storm had passed, but the real tempest was just beginning.